Hello and greetings from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Welcome to our webinar series, Global Dialogue. My name is Liane Hentschke and I'm serving as the Executive Director of the Council and today acting as a moderator. TNWAC is a non-partisan, non-profit organization dedicated to promoting global literacy and international awareness through 4 programs that connect Tennesseans with the world. Distinguished Speaker Series and with 16 luncheon events per year, webinars, Student Leaders Without Borders, and Global Eats. Please check on our website, tnwac.org, for the events we have this fall 2025 and soon spring 2026. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Global Dialogue webinar and to introduce our distinguished guest, Mr. Adam Ratzlaff. Adam will be speaking on an America's First Foreign Policy, exploring the evolving relationship between the United States and Latin America, and examining the opportunities and challenges that define this critical moment for the Americas. Now, let me tell you more about our guest. Adam Ratzlaff is the founder and CEO of Pan American Strategic Advisors, a boutique consulting firm and think tank focused on the Western Hemisphere. He is also a member of the Diplomatical Careers World in 2050 Brain Trust. With over a decade of experience in regional affairs, Adam has consulted for the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the U.S. Department of State. He has authored and co-authored more than 130 analyses, reports, and academic publications on topics related to inter-American affairs, and his work has been featured in major outlets across the country. Adam is currently completing his PhD in international relations at Florida International University. He also holds a master's degree from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver and a bachelor's degree from Tulane University, where he triple majored in international relations, economics, and Latin American studies. So for our audience, please remember that you can use the chat feature to submit your questions during the program. Well, Adam, let us start this session. Latin America and the Caribbean are rarely a core focus of the U.S. foreign policies. Why does the United States have focused so little on the region in the past and now is one of the government's priorities? What caused this shift?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me here with the Tennessee World Affairs Council. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to have talk about this important topic. The United States, since the 1970s, really has been ignoring Latin America and the Caribbean. There was a peak in the 1980s during the Cold War where we paid attention to Central America, but as a whole, the region has been what analysts have referred to as in a state of benign neglect. And the reason for that is multifold. One is largely it's a zone of peace. There haven't been major interstate wars between Latin American countries for decades. There's a few minor incidents here and there, but nothing to the extent of what we would see in, say, Russia and Ukraine or Russia and Georgia. That's not to say that it is completely peaceful, obviously. There's high levels of crime in many countries, some severe homicide rates, etc. The other thing is that the United States often gets drawn into other hotspots. As a global superpower, the United States has often been forced to focus on Europe, on Asia, on the Middle East, even when a president of the United States focuses on the Americas, his attention is drawn away. Perhaps the best example of this is actually George W. Bush. When he ran for president, his primary focus was on North America. on really working on immigration issues. And then 9/11 happened. And his entire foreign policy shifted from focusing on the Americas, on focusing on North America, to the Middle East. The other reason that we argue that there's a real lack of interest is that the public doesn't care about Latin America. As a whole, with the exception of immigration, the general public in the United States has a better idea of what's happening in other regions and thus puts pressure on governments and on their elected officials to care about those regions. We could think about like, why is it that we have such a good relationship with France? Everybody has an opinion about France. Nobody has an opinion about Latin America. And some of this is just due to the culture, right? We see cultural products produced in the United States that really think about Europe, that think about Asia in ways that we may not see towards Latin America and the Caribbean. Um, for instance, looking at Netflix, you see Emily in Paris versus Narcos, and you go, oh, which country do you want to have a good relationship with? Paris. We could look even at how people have responded to the big fires with the burning of the Notre Dame versus the Brazilian National Museum. One covered extensively in US public media, in the news. The other, people forget about it. They happened within a year of each other, but we don't think about that. And that's one of the reasons I'm so glad actually to be here. At Pan American Strategic Advisors, one of our programs we call Beyond the Beltway. And the idea is that in historical times of good US Latin American foreign policy, there have been concerted efforts to make the US public care about Latin America, the Caribbean. So we try to reach out to groups outside of just DC in New York to influence policy, but to the general public to encourage them to see why Latin America matters to them. But what's causing the current shift right now? There's several things. The reason that we care about Latin America under the Trump administration in particular has been that there's a huge concern about the rise of China in the region. Which has led to a retrenchment of U.S. foreign policy towards the Americas. There's been a cooling of free trade, and kind of looking more inward. Some have referred to Trump as an isolationist. Really, it's more of a hemispheric approach to the region. We've also seen growing public dissatisfaction with the forever wars in the Middle East and the linkage of some key domestic issues to issues happening in the hemisphere, whether that's drugs, trade, immigration, or security. And all of these trends were obviously accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which really drew attention to some of the concerns that we were seeing globally and pulled them back towards the hemisphere.
What are the main concerns or opportunities that the United States has in Latin America and the Caribbean? Are these interests shared across the political spectrum, or are we seeing shifts in priorities between US presidential administrations?
So I really like how you asked if this is a bipartisan or a shift between administrations. And I would argue that in the recent past, we've started to see the emergence of a bipartisan consensus around what the key issues are that are impacting the region, but with huge differences in how those issues are approached. And what I've been arguing with different groups is that there's really four key areas where we start to see this consensus emerge. The first is the importance of trade. Because of the rise of China, because of these different issues, there's been a real concerted effort away from free trade towards what's called nearshoring and reshoring. The second is obviously the concern over the rise of China. Both parties have seen this as a real threat to US hegemony globally, and increasingly in the region itself as we see Chinese involvement in the Americas expand. A third issue that's really become a key, we often think of it as a domestic issue, but it has domestic and international consequences, is immigration. Both parties have started to look at immigration as a challenge that needs to be addressed. Obviously, there's big differences in how the Biden administration and the Trump administration have approached this, kind of what we could look at as deportations versus root causes. And then the fourth area where there's a bipartisan consensus has been on the idea of democracy promotion. Which countries are considered democratic and not kind of varies between the different parties, and which ones should be prioritized. Um, for instance, Biden really put a lot of pressure on Guatemala and Brazil, with efforts on Venezuela as well. Whereas Trump really spoke out about the quote unquote troika of tyranny during his first term, which is Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and has really doubled down on those areas in particular during his second term. The other thing I would say, and it's I think really important, is to just say that with the approaches being so different and kind of the prioritization of these things, some of the approaches have been very similar. And one that's really worth highlighting as an opportunity for companies and that are interested in engaging in Latin America is the degree to which the US government wants the private sector to engage in Latin America and the Caribbean. During the first Trump administration, he initiated what was called the Americas Crece initiative to encourage private sector investment in the Americas to create those linkages, that nearshoring incentive. At the same time, during Biden, you saw the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity and the Partnership for Central America that were both designed to kind of create private sector incentives to invest in the region. So largely, there's an agreement on the issues, but how they approach them has been completely separated based on kind of how they prioritize them and how they see the challenges affecting the United States.
Yeah. Marco Rubio has stated that he thinks the United States needs an American first policy. What has this looked like so far in the Trump administration?
Yes. So shortly after taking office, Marco Rubio's first trip internationally was actually to Latin America, which is it's been a long time since that was the first trip for a Secretary of State. Most prefer to go to Asia, prefer to go to Europe. Um, in the lead up to that trip, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said there was a need for an Americas first, right? Focusing back onto the hemisphere for the foreign policy. And we can see this shift happening in a lot of important ways. Not only was it the first trip to the region, there's been several high-level visits from different cabinet level officials and senior level officials to the region. And you can see it in just who Trump put on his team. Obviously, Marco Rubio has had a long focus on the Americas historically. Um, his Undersecretary of State, Landau, is also a former ambassador to Mexico, has a lot of experience in the region. Mike Waltz, his first national security advisor before Rubio took that hat on as well, was from Florida and had a strong opinion, particularly on the role of China in the region. And he actually appointed a special envoy for Latin America very quickly. Um, the special envoy has now stepped aside. It was always supposed to be a kind of temporary position. The other data point that I think is really important to highlight how important the region was to the Trump administration is the number of ambassadorial nominees. By the end of 2025, Trump had turned to Truth Social or X to announce 10 different nominees for ambassadorships in the Americas before taking office. That's a huge number. Just to compare that to Biden for a minute, Biden had 14 confirmed ambassadors in the region a year into his term. Big differences in terms of kind of that prioritization of putting ambassadors on the ground. So why is that? Part of it is that there's such that overlap between the Trump administration's domestic agenda and regional affairs, particularly around immigration, drugs, and trade. We see that kind of playing out in the specific actions that the Trump administration has taken. First is that they're having all these high-level visits, both from Latin American leaders to Washington, but also from all of the cabinet level officials to the region. The special envoy, Mauricio Claver-Carron, when they first announced tariffs, even pointed to it and said, this is not just, and I'm going to get the quote a little off here, I'm sure, but um, he said something to the effect of, this is not just a great day for America, but a great day for the Americas, and highlighted the fact that there were lower tariff rates for most Latin American countries than there were for any other part of the world. It's important to note that there are some key exceptions there. Venezuela had high tariffs still. Brazil now faces very high tariffs. They didn't at the time. And Mexico and Canada were also facing high tariffs at that point. It's also worth noting that this comes as still a huge increase in tariff rates for Latin American countries from where they were, because the majority of US free trade agreements are with countries in the Americas. It's actually 12 out of 20 of the countries that the United States has free trade agreements with are from Latin America and the Caribbean, including and Canada, counted within that Americas group. The other thing that we've seen is kind of an America's first approach is this immigration crackdown and deportations. It's been a key area, and because of that, it requires the support of countries to receive deportees. So it's been a primary focus of the administration to really develop partnerships with key countries, notably El Salvador, but also having to negotiate with the Maduro regime in Venezuela to reaccept deportees. We've also seen kind of some pressure points leveraged in these discussions around deportations. Back in January, Colombian President Gustavo Petro refused to accept deportees from the United States. particularly coming from a military plane. He said this was a rejection of the rights of the Colombian population. Um, this very quickly turned into a fight via social media, and Trump threatened tariffs on the country. Petro ended up backing down, and those were resolved at least temporarily. And the other piece that we've really seen is kind of key to this America's First is the leveraging of tariffs, concessions, and the use of even military force where needed, but all focused kind of within this hemispheric approach.
Turning to some of the key areas that you mentioned as central components of the U.S. Latin American foreign policy. China's engagement in the region has raised a lot of alarms in Washington. What does Chinese engagement looks like, and why has China been able to make so many inroads?
China's involvement in the Americas has a pretty long history, and has really, really expanded since the early 2000s. Today, China is the leading trade partner with several countries in Latin America, across the Caribbean, and is involved in a number of different regional organizations and forums. Most notably, they hold it's about every 3 years, the CELAC or the China CELAC Forum, where it brings together leaders from across the Americas to meet with China and discuss areas of shared interest. I would encourage everyone to check out our website. We actually do have a dashboard that we recently launched looking at China's trade patterns within the region so that you can see where China has made the most inroads, but also the different blocks that they've become a member of. Part of the interest from China is that for a long time, Latin America and the Caribbean was one of the primary places that still recognized Taiwan. It still is. Several of the countries that recognize Taiwan are located within the Caribbean specifically. And because of that, China is really trying to enter with as many resources as possible. One thing that we've looked at pretty heavily is the use of loans, government loans from China to the region. These peaked in 2010, so it's been a while, and they've been in decline for a bit. But in 2010, Chinese loans to the region were higher than the combined loans of the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the U.S. Export-Import Bank, at least according to data from the Inter-American Dialogue, to the region. Why is China entering so forcefully? Part of this is to access key resources. Latin America has a lot of natural resources that have helped to fuel China's miraculous economic growth. That includes iron, um, food stuffs, and today, and arguably what's become most important in this, is rare earth minerals. China is investing heavily, particularly in the lithium markets in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. The other thing they've invested heavily in is key infrastructure. This includes telecommunications. Huawei's 5G has been particularly problematic for the United States, spaceports and space cooperation areas, smart cities, and ports, right? Where ships are going to so they can get goods from Latin America back to China. This has raised a lot of alarm bells because many of these resources are considered dual use, where the Chinese military could also use these resources if there was a conflict with the United States. Recently, and there's a great article in this in the most recent edition of America's Quarterly, it highlighting the amount of military cooperation also between China and Latin American and Caribbean militaries across the Americas, particularly with Brazil, but we're seeing it across the region. We've also seen China sign several FTAs with Latin America and the Caribbean, including with Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. The U.S. response to this, though, has been pretty muted for a long time. Particularly the first decade or so, there wasn't a huge pushback from the United States about Chinese engagement with the region. Part of that, once again, is this benign neglect we were talking about. The United States was so focused on what was happening in the Middle East, it wasn't focused on what was happening within the Americas. Today, we're starting to see some of that change, and particularly around kind of 5G, lithium, and these broader dual technology concerns. What I argued, though, recently with a colleague of mine in responsible statecraft is that if we're going to understand Chinese involvement in the Americas and really seek to counter it, it requires not just looking at what the United States does, but also looking at why Latin American and Caribbean countries want China to engage with them. Part of this is the economic opportunity. China is a massive market. Soybeans from both Brazil and Argentina have been a major export crop to Argentina, or I'm sorry, to China, and provide a very critical source of financing. It's also been that China invests in some of these infrastructures that countries in the region really want and need. 5G was expensive. China was coming in not just with the technology as an offer, putting it in at a low cost, but also offering financing with those things, often tied to some other issues, but it was a useful component of that. As well as with the ports, China recently financed the mega port of Chongqing in Peru, which is a state-of-the-art, massive port, deep water port to allow goods out of Peru to be shipped specifically to Asia. The United States hasn't been able to offer that kind of financing and resources, or hasn't at least been interested in doing so. The other piece of this, of course, is the United States has its own troubled history with the region that China doesn't have, which has allowed China to really frame itself as being a partner in the anti-imperialist struggle, highlighting itself as also being a developing country, promoting South-South cooperation and win-win agreements, which is not always the case. And the other piece of this is, of course, that the United States fails to kind of highlight the work that it does in the region itself. One of the examples I really like to point to is a report from the Atlantic Council highlighting that during the COVID pandemic, despite the United States providing more vaccines and higher quality vaccines to much of the region, public perception is that China did more. China showed up first. Every time vaccines came in, they rolled out a red carpet, literally a red carpet to the airplane. The ambassador showed up. They made a big show of giving vaccines to the people. Meanwhile, what the region saw was the United States, through CNN International and other groups, having trouble dealing with the pandemic at home and not being willing to provide those same resources.
Adam, thank you so much for raising those important issues and inform people what is the true situation in Latin America and China coming in, not only Latin America, but also Africa, and the importance that people know where the Latin America is in relation to the US now. Well, Trump has taken a tough stance and being vocal about the risks of China engagement in the Panama Canal. What is happening on this front, and what are the implications for U.S.-Panamanian relations and competition with China in that place? Yeah.
China, well, Trump has been very vocal on the Panama Canal, sometimes to the point of undermining his own interest with the region. Back in December, he first said that he was going to take back the canal, which, given kind of the historical legacies of the canal, was particularly sensitive, not just to Panamanians, but to leaders across the region who saw it as a move of U.S. imperialism. That being said, the concern of Chinese involvement in the canal is that there is a Chinese firm that manages the operations of docks on both sides of the canal. The Molino administration, which is the Panamanian president, has taken a hard line and had taken a hard line previously on pushing back against China, but has stepped up efforts even further. This has created some legal challenges as far as who's able to manage the canal, what are the contracts are, and a lot of components related to this. So a lot of it's hinging on now is the question of what the Supreme Court decides in terms of who is allowed, can the contracts with China be canceled and replaced by a U.S. firm? There is interest in the United States to do so. I want to kind of re-highlight this because I think that there's a point here that is a real risk for the Trump administration and for U.S. foreign policy towards the region more broadly, which is the pushing too hard. A colleague and I talked about this a little bit in a piece for Latinoamérica 21, where we highlighted that if Trump pushes too hard, it can create backlash domestically that presidents in other countries have to deal with and can end up turning them against the administration or against the United States more broadly. You're seeing some of this with Molino, where we've seen protests about kind of kowtowing to U.S. pressure. Once again, he was pretty anti-China beforehand, so some of this is difficult. But we've seen this happen in other countries too. I think the most infamous example, perhaps, is the pressure on the Canadian government. There was a pro-Trump candidate who was likely to win. By putting too much pressure on Canada, it really sponsored a more nationalistic response and a leader who was not what Trump wanted in the election of Carney. So I think that there's a push and pull factor here that needs to be understood with what the domestic politics look like within countries as well.
Yeah. Let's move to trade, the US trade, because you also mentioned that there is a bipartisan shift in US trade preferences and a turn towards nearshoring. Could you expand on what you mean by this shift and what it means for the US relations with Latin America and the Caribbean? And also, how has Trump tariff policy impact relations with Latin America and the Caribbean? Were they only for an economic rationale or for political pressure?
So what's interesting about the tariff policy and kind of this turn against free trade is that historically, the United States has a long, long effort of trying to promote a integrated Americas. This can go back clear to 1889 when we had the first Pan American Conference in Washington, D.C. One of the issues that Washington brought to the table was the desire to create a joint customs union. I mean, can you imagine in 1889 an EU of the Americas designed to have collective tariffs across the region? It's shocking to think about, but it dates clear back to that period. In fact, at that same conference, the predecessor to the Organization of American States, which is kind of like the United Nations of the Americas, it represents the different countries of the Americas. Its predecessor was called the Pan American Commercial Bureau and was really designed to promote trade and integration, and then moved on and kind of evolved into more of a political body. You see the same thing in the 1990s, signing of NAFTA, which actually sparked discussions about creating a free trade agreement of the Americas that would have included all of the hemisphere. Globally, we've also seen the United States really be a champion of free trade, supporting the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and then the development of the World Trade Organization, once again in the 1990s. But since really we can mark this before, but like the big political shift happens in 2016, where both political parties have a candidate who is actively opposed to the signing of new free trade agreements in a major candidate. So whether that's Bernie Sanders from the Democrats or Donald Trump, the idea of killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a really strong, or at least not entering into it, was a strong pressure. And we've really seen this grow within kind of both political parties to where neither party wants to sign a new free trade agreement. Part of that's due to deindustrialization and kind of the job losses associated with all the free trade agreements that have been signed. Part of it's due to concerns about the US losing its edge in manufacturing, particularly to China. And then it was all exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which showcased that a lot of our supply chains were weak. We couldn't get access to PPE when it was needed because all of it was produced abroad. Um, the Ever Given's blocking of the Suez Canal, which disrupted trade, same thing, showcased the need to bring some of these supply chains closer home. This has created kind of political pressure to do one of three different things. One would be reshoring, bring jobs back into the United States. The other would be nearshoring, bring jobs back closer to the United States so that the supply chains are more closely linked. And the third is called friendshoring, or bringing jobs back in and building supply chains only with allies so we don't have to worry if there was a conflict, what that would look like. Both parties have kind of embraced this in different ways and to different extents of which of those three actions they would want to take. As far as how it's looking in the Americas, is it political pressure or is it for economic purposes? The answer is kind of both, right? There are real benefits of near and reshoring as far as making sure the supply chains are secure, reducing transportation costs, making sure that you bring jobs to the United States, albeit some of this comes with higher cost consumers as we move jobs into higher income countries. Part of it is also, though, due to political pressure, right? We can look at different countries where Trump administration has really, really pushed on key issues. Drugs, trying to encourage both Mexico and Canada to really implement tougher bans on fentanyl immigration. I mentioned Colombia earlier and kind of the effort to ensure that they were taking deportees, or in the case of Brazil, pressuring domestic political groups to change their decisions. The other piece that I think is really important to this is it's not just political in terms of domestic political consideration and domestic economic considerations, but also some of the national security concerns. And this is where that friendshoring, nearshoring comes in too, is if there were a conflict, or another disaster like the pandemic, would the United States be able to access the resources that it needs? If these events happen, where would we get those goods? So national security concerns kind of falls in between of being both political and economic consideration when you look at this. I do want to quickly, since we're talking with the Tennessee World Affairs Council, note that like the Mexico-Canada piece is really, really important for your state. Tennessee is, I believe, the 16th ranked trading state within the United States. And in 2024, Mexico and Canada were Tennessee's top export partners. They were also number 2 and 4 for imports. Number one was, not surprisingly, China. We import a lot from China. And because of that, the ongoing USMCA renegotiation or review is really important for the state as a whole, as well as some of these other nearshoring questions. Could there be opportunities to expand beyond just beyond North America into the rest of the region? As far as how this is impacting the relations with other countries in the region, the first thing I would say is, and what's been fascinating is a recent study by Arturo Porosikansky that he published in America's Quarterly noted that with the exception of Mexico, tariffs have actually not been as negative for the region as first expected. There was kind of a view that as soon as the United States put on tariffs, it would create huge disruptions across the economy. That hasn't happened to the extent that was anticipated. That being said, what's happened is Latin American countries have very quickly started to look for alternatives in case things get worse. We can see this between the closer trading ties between Mexico and Canada. Brazil has also approached Canada about a potential free trade agreement. Mercosur is looking at FTAs with the EU, and really expanding those alternative options to make sure that their trade portfolios are diversified if access to US markets isn't available.
Mhm. Let's talk a little bit, and thank you again for talking about these issues very clearly, Adam. I would like to move to the terrorist organizations because in another one of his executive actions, President Trump labeled several cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. We have recently seen the administration destroy what they claim are cartel terrorist vessels off the coast of Venezuela. What is your view about that?
So this FTO designation or foreign terrorist designation that was applied by the Trump administration to several different cartels across the region, most of which are, despite the fact that we're kind of focused on Venezuela right now, most of which are headquartered within Mexico. Headquartered might not quite be the right word, are based in Mexico. One piece of this, of course, has been labeling Maduro as the head of the cartels and saying that he's integrated within them. That's not been the assessment of the intelligence community, but that's neither here nor there. And the other piece of this is, this is going to have implications not just for US Latin American foreign policy, but also for companies that are operating in the region. And I would argue in some ways, greater implications for the companies operating in the region. In terms of the foreign policy, what we've seen is that the FTO designation has really been used as a justification to increase pressure on Venezuela. And that's where we're seeing these vessels being destroyed. We're seeing the sending now of a aircraft carrier to the southern Caribbean. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to speak about the legality of it. Seems like a little bit of a stretch to me that to use the global war on terror as justification. But we've now seen 10 boats destroyed off the coast of Venezuela. And that includes actually a couple on the Pacific side as well. So it is expanding rapidly. It also has meant that we've seen calls for military action in Venezuela that may be targeted strikes. We've heard reporting that covert actions taken by the CIA have been approved within country. All of these things kind of are falling within that global war on terror permission from Congress. The bigger issue, though, in my mind, is what this means for companies. The FTO designations are mm, pretty alarming in the sense that it raises the reputational and legal risks for companies that are operating in the region, particularly in states where the cartels are very deeply embedded within kind of local governance structures, um, or are operating in areas where goods are both legal and illegal. So one of those that I would like to point at is, for instance, illegal logging. In the past, we've seen the cartels get involved in illegal logging, and companies have seen illegally produced wood, meaning it was farmed out of an area that didn't have, that was kind of a protected zone, entered into their supply chains. Before, this was a criminal group that was doing this. Now you could face the risks of being labeled as a material sponsor of terrorism. These drive really big risks for companies that operate in the region. I mentioned Tennessee being really closely tied to Mexico. Mexico is a case where this could be a real problem for companies that are operating, highlighting the need to do really good due diligence work, but also just make sure that you know where your supply chain is and who's operating within it. Oil is another one that the cartels have gotten involved in kind of stealing oil from oil production and could become a real challenge for different countries or for different companies operating in the region.
Adam, I grew up in Brazil, and there was always a sense of anti-American feeling by the population, perhaps because of the coups and that happened in the 60s. So my question is, are there any countries in Latin America where the United States has good relationship at the moment? Are these long-term opportunities to improve U.S. relations with the region?
This question about kind of simmering anti-American sentiment, I think
Mhm.
is really interesting for a couple of reasons. So first is there's an interesting divide sometimes between the elite within a country and the general population. And this, I'm going to step back to the FTO question a little because I think it's an interesting case point. Right now, the Mexican government is doing a good job negotiating with the United States, but there has historically been, particularly in Mexico, a simmering anti-American sentiment. We took half their territory. We've invaded the country a few times or sent troops across the border and violated sovereignty. If the FTOs, if the Trump administration uses this FTO designation to, say, perform a drone strike on Mexican cartels, it's going to be very hard, even if it's accepted by the government who says, yes, we want to get rid of these cartels. Um, the general population is not necessarily going to view it that way. And we're actually even seeing some anti-American sentiment bubbling up in like Mexico City, where cost of living protests, you start to see kind of an anti-American sentiment that comes out of that just from cost of living. If there's a military strike, I would expect to see that really escalate quickly. That being said, the Trump administration has actually forged pretty good relationships with several governments in the region. There are some countries where we have very, very rocky relationships. We've already mentioned Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela. But there are some that the Trump administration has forged pretty close relations. So last summer, summer 2024, Marco Rubio actually wrote an article for the National Interest where he highlighted a set of countries that he viewed as real allies to the United States that he would want to work with. These included countries like Argentina, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Paraguay, Panama, Peru, and Guyana. Whew, that was a mouthful. But he, of these, I'd say there's really three that we've seen really stand out during the Trump administration. The first is Argentina. Milei has been a very vocal supporter of the Trump administration and just received a $20 billion currency swap from the US Treasury to help stabilize the economy in Venezuela or in Argentina. So the Milei administration, I think, has been one of those countries that we see really close relations with. The other is El Salvador. Bukele has been adored by kind of the global right as a whole, including speaking at CPAC conferences, and has been a very large supporter of the Trump administration, supporting deportations to CICAT, the large prison in El Salvador. And the third that I think is worth mentioning again is Panama. Panama has really done a lot to support the Trump administration and its interests around the canal and in their own concerns about China. And I think that those three countries really highlight areas where there's some promise. Now, that being said, I would flag that the longevity of these is in question. The first is, to your point at the beginning, domestic politics. If the Trump administration is viewed as being too aggressive on some of these issues and doesn't understand the domestic political situation within these countries, he may see blowback from the general populace, which will force these presidents to do something against the administration, to look like they're taking a stand, or in the next elections to see the political pendulum swing away towards another president. The other issue here is personalism. The administration's relationships with these leaders is very personal in nature. It's about Milei, it's about Bukele, it's about Trump. It's not about kind of the broader geopolitical interests necessarily aligning in all of these cases. Um, the one that I've actually written about for Diplomatic Courier and kind of framed as a real challenge for this is Argentina. Um, Milei is a unique individual who has come to power, and I think putting all of our eggs in this is the new Argentina is challenging. We did this in the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, Carlos Menem was president of Argentina. He sought to improve relations with the United States to the point where he referred to the relationship as carnal. He said, "We have carnal relations with the United States. We are so close." And yet, shortly thereafter, there was an economic crisis, and we saw the rise of Kirchnerism in Argentina and a very, very confrontational relationship between Christina Kirchner in particular, and both the Obama and Trump administrations as a result of that.
Yes. We go to my last questions here, and we have one question from the audience. Are there any ongoing or upcoming signs or events that we should be watching to better understand what's going on in the region?
Absolutely. So there are four areas that I think are really worth paying attention to see kind of the trajectory of U.S. Latin American foreign policy more broadly. One is what I already mentioned with the USMCA process. I think that where that goes is it's one of the largest trading blocs in the world, and it's going to have real implications for how we understand North American trade broadly, and where free trade moves from here. Tennessee being a major part of that block should be paying attention to that in particular. The second thing is what happens in Panama with this court ruling. Um, I think it's going to dictate a lot about kind of the broader direction of U.S. engagement in the region as far as how it views China. Is it willing to go through some of these legal channels, or does it try to take a harder line approach um, to countries in the region? The third is the escalation of military pressure. Um, I mentioned that we've now seen ships destroyed off the coast of Colombia as well on the Pacific side of the continent. I think that where we see military use is going to have some real challenges, not just for the Trump administration, but moving forward. My apologies. And finally, and this is more of an event that I think is really worth paying attention to, is the Summit of the Americas. So in December, the Dominican Republic is going to be hosting leaders from across the region at what's called the Summit of the Americas. The first of which, by the way, was hosted by Bill Clinton with the objective of unifying the Americas, um, in part for that free trade agreement of the Americas, but also towards a new, more productive, more multilateral approach to the region. We're already seeing countries saying they're not going. So the Dominican Republic is not inviting Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela. And because of that, Mexico and Colombia have already said they're not going. We're down from 35 to 30 countries now. There's also questions about Trump attending for security reasons. I personally hope he does. I think that it's important for U.S. Latin American foreign policy that the president of the United States is there, um, and representing that we are part of this community, part of the community of the Americas. However, the Trump administration has been pretty opposed to multilateralism in the region. Undersecretary of State Landau questioned the utility of the Organization of American States and said that they would start to question and review the funding that they were offering to the organization. But there's a good probability and some buzz around what might happen around the summits and some U.S. initiatives that might go forward. One is return of these initiatives to encourage U.S. companies to invest in the Americas through either the Americas Crece initiative or, as was recently reported, the Americas Trade and Investment Act, which is a bipartisan bill aimed at encouraging U.S. companies to nearshore and reshore into the Americas. This was introduced last year, but to kind of realign it with the current political environment is under review, and having some modifications made to it.
Yes, we have one question here, and please, participants can use the chat to ask more questions. But here we go. What upcoming elections in Latin America within the next year or so could have the most impact to the United States? Would Colombia have a major impact?
So I think the Colombian election is really important. Gustavo Petro is the country's first leftist president, and has faced a lot of problems in governing, not just on his foreign policy, but in implementing a variety of his agenda, including kind of having to, there's been a lot of turnover within his cabinet. So I think that there's a degree of stability within Colombia that the next administration is likely to offer. Um, if it shifts back to the right, there's also some opportunities, I think, for the Trump administration in particular to really try to engage with them. The other major election happening next year is, excuse me, Brazil. Brazil is another country where it is such a massive country that we don't really, it's hard to imagine the size of Brazil when we talk about Latin America and kind of its importance within the broader, not just regional ecosystem, but global ecosystem. One of the statistics I like to flag with this is the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo is larger than Chile in terms of population. It's massive. So where those elections go is also going to have some pretty serious implications. I would also point to the recent elections in Bolivia. The Movimiento al Socialismo has been in power for about 20 years and just left power for the first time. This could open the door to kind of a renewed approach to Bolivia in particular, which is super critical given kind of the country's lack of infrastructure, but also the fact that it's a part of the Lithium Triangle. So there's some real opportunities there for the United States to really engage with the country. I should add that previous Bolivian administrations like kicked out the DEA and did a lot of things that really challenged the relationship with the United States.
Yes, Latin America is so diverse, and you mentioned Brazil as a big country. We are many, culturally speaking, many countries in one big country.
Yes.
Because we are very diverse from the south to the north and northeast and uh, west, and so it's very diverse. So Adam, there are so many issues to talk about Latin America and U.S. relations that we would need another webinar in the future or an in-person event with you and some colleagues. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah.
We don't have any other questions, so the program will be archived and available on TNWAC.org.
Yep.
And sir, sorry,
No, I was just going to say, it looks like we actually do have two more questions from Pat
oh,
Ryan. They're in the queue.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry
Sorry,
about that.
it
I just
was
wanted to make sure
another chat.
we didn't miss him.
I'm sorry. Can you drill down on the Venezuelan conflict? Is there any validity to the White House assertions about drug flows from Venezuela compared to other producers? Pat Ryan asked that question.
So drug flows out of Venezuela are significantly smaller than other countries in the region, particularly when we're talking about the framing of this as about US opioid deaths. Fentanyl is not what's coming out of Venezuela. There is some cocaine, but it's small compared to other countries. And it's not fentanyl coming out of Venezuela. As far as the conflict goes more broadly, the United States and Venezuela have had a very rocky relationship since 1999 when Hugo Chavez came to power. And it has deteriorated rapidly since Chavez died in 2013. The Trump administration was actually very, very active in promoting an alternative government in 2019. I'm sorry, not in 2019. We'll pull a blank on the year here. But Juan Guaido came out and said, I'm the new interim president. And the Trump administration backed him very heavily. Because of that, there were some real opportunities. Um, there were some real challenges as well, but I think the Trump administration is going to continue to push on Venezuela, whether that's through military use, tariffs. I think there's going to continue to be a lot of tension in that.
The other question is, can you talk about the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of the Organization of American States in resolving issues like mass migration and human rights?
Absolutely. So the OAS, as with all international organizations, faces a number of challenges in implementing its agenda. In part, there's 35 diverse voices that are out there and have different opinions on each of these issues. On top of that, the Americas are home to about 45 different regional organizations and forum, including trade blocs, um, that have overlapping mandates and memberships. And one of the things that we've seen happen consistently is that countries get fed up with the OAS and turn to one of these organizations rather than addressing the governance challenges within the OAS itself. A key example of this is kind of the negotiations with Maduro was it's not working, so he'll turn to another body and say we're going to restart negotiations under CELAC rather than under the OAS umbrella, or we're going to work through this body to do this. We also see this with like electoral observation, where it's been a problem, is the OAS has historically done a really good job on electoral monitoring. Um, Other regional organizations also have election monitors that don't have the same strict guidelines for making sure that elections are fair. UNASUR has actually been one of these. They were used to accompany an election in Venezuela that was viewed pretty widely as unfair, but Maduro refused to invite the OAS to also observe that election. When it comes to human rights, broadly speaking, the OAS system has actually been pretty effective in certain areas. There's the Inter-American Court for Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which both kind of fall under, they're not within the OAS, well, the commission is within the OAS. The court is a separate institution, but kind of within the broader Inter-American system. And those are often considered the jewels of the Inter-American system. They were pretty effective in pushing for human rights challenges and changes in Argentina during the dictatorship, and have moved forward on a few key issues. That said, on other issues, it's been a mixed bag. Um, my own work often looks at the role of the OAS in promoting democracy. We have seen that they were extremely effective in ensuring the transition of power in Guatemala a couple of years ago, where there was an attempt to not allow the president to after winning the election, to take his seat. The OAS put a lot of pressure on elites within the country, and we did see Bernardo Arevalo take the presidency. Um, that being said, you can look at cases like Venezuela, and that hasn't happened.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions, and thank you, Adam, once more. Just to finish our presentation of today, I would say that you should consider becoming a member and a donor supporting of the Council to carry out its missions through all programs of global affairs. The Winter Spring Distinguished Speaker Series will be posted soon on our website. Please check the outstanding speakers we prepared for you. Thank you all, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, everyone.